The first Sunday after Grace's funeral, I unlocked the front door of our house expecting silence. Instead, I found a small cedar box sitting on the kitchen table exactly where she'd always sorted her choir music after church. I was certain I'd emptied every drawer before the funeral, yet there it was, tied with the same faded blue ribbon she'd worn in the choir for nearly 40 years. Inside were dozens of unsigned donation receipts, every one stamped nearly an hour after choir practice officially ended. Before I could make sense of them, the church secretary called and quietly told me several financial records connected to those same Sundays had vanished overnight. Why would anyone erase evidence after my wife was gone? If you've ever discovered that the person you loved left behind one final act of kindness waiting to be understood, stay with me. For 50 years, Grace and I lived by routines so dependable they hardly needed words. I served 26 years as an Air Force aircraft mechanic, and habits followed me into retirement. Every tool had its place. Every receipt had a folder. Every promise deserved to be kept. Grace understood that better than anyone. Every Sunday looked the same. We sat together in the third pew from the front at St. Matthew's Community Church. She sang with the choir while I helped inspect loose railings, stubborn door hinges, and aging furnace vents before the morning service. Afterward, she'd smile, kiss my cheek, and say, "I'll only be another little while." I never questioned it. She always came home about an hour later carrying her blue choir folder and humming whatever hymn they'd practiced that morning. Now I wondered what happened during that missing hour. The cedar box contained 36 donation receipts. None carried Grace's name. Everyone listed anonymous gift. The amounts were small, $20, $15, sometimes $50. But one detail refused to leave my mind. Every receipt referenced the same internal ministry account. Family Assistance, Case 27. No family name, no address, only that number. I spread the receipts across the dining room table in chronological order, the same way I'd once organized aircraft maintenance logs. Patterns reveal themselves when emotion steps aside long enough to let facts breathe. The dates stretched across 22 years. Grace had never missed a single season. Not through snowstorms, not through surgeries, not even after my retirement. Someone had faithfully accepted those donations week after week. The phone rang again. Helen Mercer, our church secretary, sounded unusually hesitant. "Dean, would you mind coming by tomorrow morning? Is something wrong?" A pause. I was organizing records for Grace's memorial display. And? I can't find the Sunday financial binders from several of those years. I looked back at the anonymous receipts scattered before me. Have they ever gone missing before? No. Another silence settled between us. Then Helen spoke more softly. "Dean, someone removed them after the funeral." I glanced once more at the faded blue ribbon wrapped around Grace's little cedar box. For the first time since losing her, I realized I wasn't simply grieving my wife. I was standing at the beginning of a mystery she had quietly carried alone for decades. The next morning, I arrived at St. Matthew's before the sanctuary doors officially opened. Grace had always loved the quiet hour before Sunday school classes filled the hallways. She used to say an empty church revealed more truth than a crowded one because every sound seemed honest. Walking through those familiar halls without her felt like stepping into a home where someone had quietly removed the heartbeat. Helen Mercer was waiting beside the church office. She looked older than I remembered only a week earlier. Grief can do that. Or worry. "Thank you for coming, Dean. You sounded concerned." "I am." She unlocked the records room and motioned for me to follow. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls. Most carried neatly typed labels dating back decades. One drawer remained open. Empty. The Sunday financial binders were here. "When did you last see them?" "The Thursday before Grace's funeral." "And after that?" She slowly shook her head. They simply disappeared. I crouched beside the cabinet. Years of maintaining aircraft taught me to notice small disturbances other people overlooked. The dust told its own story. 3 binders had been removed recently. Not hurriedly, carefully. Only those 3. Nothing else had been disturbed. "Who has keys?" I asked. Helen hesitated. "Me, Pastor Williams, and Thomas Avery. The treasurer?" She nodded. I filed the information away without drawing conclusions. Experience had taught me something equally valuable. The first obvious answer usually isn't the right one. Before we could continue, Samuel Pierce stepped into the doorway carrying a stack of choir folders. Grace's choir director looked genuinely saddened. "Dean, I'm glad you came. I wanted to ask about Grace." A faint smile crossed my face. "I've been trying to do the same." Samuel looked toward the empty filing drawer. "Helen told you." "She did." He sighed. "Grace stayed after choir because she loved helping people." "What kind of help?" "Oh, whatever needed doing. Cleaning, organizing music, preparing flowers." His explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. Too reasonable. I thought about the anonymous receipts. 22 years, 36 donations, always after choir, always tied to Case 27. Did she ever mention family assistance? Samuel blinked. "Of course. Our church has helped dozens of families. Case 27? His smile faded just enough for me to notice. "I honestly don't remember numbers." Technically true, emotionally incomplete. He changed the subject almost immediately. "Grace never wanted recognition." "I know. She asked all of us to respect that." Again, true. But not the answer to my question. After Samuel left, Helen quietly closed the office door. "Dean, I probably shouldn't tell you this." "What?" "The assistance account stopped receiving anonymous donations 2 weeks before Grace passed away." I frowned. "Why?" "We never received another payment." That didn't make sense. Grace had organized every bill months in advance. She planned birthdays, anniversaries, even Christmas cards. She wouldn't simply stop after 22 years. Helen opened one remaining ledger. Only a single loose paper remained tucked inside. Not a receipt, a routing slip. Across the top, someone had written, "Case 27, transferred." No destination, no signature, just a date. The day after Grace's final Sunday in the choir. I stared at those 2 words. Transferred. Not closed, not completed. Transferred. Someone hadn't ended Grace's quiet ministry. Someone had moved it. I drove home that afternoon with more questions than answers, but I made one decision before pulling into my driveway. I wasn't going to accuse anyone. Not Samuel, not Thomas Avery, not even whoever had removed the financial binders. Grace had spent 50 years earning the trust of everyone in that church. The least I could do was protect that trust until the facts deserved something different. So the next morning, I did exactly what most people expected of a grieving widower. Nothing. I mowed the lawn, collected the mail, stopped by the hardware store for furnace filters I didn't actually need. When neighbors asked how I was doing, I smiled politely and told them I was taking things one day at a time. Meanwhile, my real work had already begun. Military maintenance taught me that when one set of records disappears, another usually survives somewhere the original author never intended. Grace knew that, too. Inside the cedar box, beneath the stack of anonymous receipts, I found one small object I had overlooked. A faded blue choir ribbon. At first it seemed sentimental. Then I noticed tiny handwriting on the inside fold. Not a message. Just 3 initials. H.M. Helen Mercer. I returned to the church that evening after choir rehearsal ended. Instead of entering through the main office, I walked toward the maintenance hallway, where I had repaired light fixtures for years. Helen was locking the copy room. "You came back." I remembered something. She looked at the ribbon in my hand and immediately lowered her eyes. "I wondered if she'd leave you that. What does it mean?" Helen didn't answer right away. Instead, she unlocked a small supply cabinet hidden beside the copy machine. From the top shelf, she removed an old attendance ledger bound in cracked brown leather. I wasn't supposed to show anyone this. Not even Pastor Williams knows it still exists. I frowned. Why keep it? Because Grace asked me to. The ledger listed every choir rehearsal for nearly 25 years. Names, attendance, volunteer hours, nothing unusual. Until I reached the final column. Every Sunday, Grace stayed after choir. Someone else left before rehearsal officially ended. Always the same family name. Ramirez. Generation after generation. Parents, then children, then grandchildren. Every few years, another Ramirez appeared. Every few years, another anonymous donation followed. I looked up. Case 27. Helen nodded. They were never strangers. They were one family. What happened to them? Tears gathered in her eyes. I promised Grace I'd never tell you unless you started asking the right questions. So tell me now. She took a slow breath. The church failed them. Those 4 words echoed through the empty hallway. How? I don't know everything. Only Grace and Thomas Avery knew the entire story. That answer caught my attention. Thomas? He handled every assistance account. So why are Samuel and everyone else acting nervous? Helen gave a tired smile. Because Grace asked us all to protect the family's privacy. Nobody realized protecting their dignity would someday look like hiding something. Everything shifted. Samuel's careful answers, Grace's anonymous gifts, the missing binders. They weren't necessarily signs of guilt. They might simply be people honoring a promise they no longer understood. Then Helen handed me one final document, not a financial record. A photocopy of an old church bulletin. One sentence had been circled in blue ink. Special congregational meeting. Financial assistance review. 22 years earlier. exactly 1 week before Grace made her first anonymous donation. I turned the page over. Someone had written one sentence in Grace's unmistakable handwriting. If the records disappear, the meeting will explain why. I looked back at Helen. Where's the original meeting file? She swallowed hard. It disappeared yesterday. The words stayed with me all night. If the records disappear, the meeting will explain why. Grace had written that sentence more than 20 years earlier, long before either of us imagined she would leave this world before me. She wasn't predicting a theft. She was preparing me to understand one. By sunrise, I had stopped asking who removed the missing files. The better question was why those particular records mattered so much. St. Matthew's kept old memorial programs in a storage room beneath the fellowship hall. Grace had helped organize them every spring, and I remembered spending one rainy Saturday repairing the shelves after a pipe burst. Military maintenance teaches you to remember buildings almost the way other people remember faces. If an old meeting file still existed anywhere, I knew exactly where someone might have forgotten it. Helen met me downstairs carrying a ring of storage keys. I checked the archive index. Nothing? The official file is gone. But? She gave a tired smile. Grace almost never trusted only one filing system. That sounded exactly like my wife. She believed important things deserved a backup. Dust floated through the basement as we opened cabinet after cabinet. Memorial bulletins stretched back nearly 60 years. Baptism registers. Choir anniversary books. Women's ministry scrapbooks. No meeting minutes, and then I noticed something odd. One shelf leaned slightly lower than the others. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for me. Years of inspecting aircraft taught me to respect tiny misalignments. I removed 3 heavy archive boxes. Behind them rested a narrow cardboard portfolio without any label. Inside lay carbon copies instead of originals. Meeting agendas. Volunteer rosters. Expense summaries. And finally, minutes from the Special Congregational Financial Assistance Review held 22 years earlier. Helen slowly sat down. I haven't seen these in years. Neither of us spoke while I read. The first pages contained ordinary budget discussions, roof repairs, heating costs, mission donations. Then everything changed. One paragraph had been underlined in blue ink. The Ramirez family has requested emergency assistance following the factory closure. Available funds are insufficient. The board recommends postponing support until next quarter. I turned the page. Another handwritten note appeared in Grace's unmistakable script. Need doesn't wait for next quarter. My throat tightened. The next pages recorded no further discussion, no vote, no follow-up. Officially, the matter simply disappeared. But Grace's donation receipts began the very next Sunday. 22 years of quiet generosity had started where the official record ended. Helen wiped a tear from her cheek. I always believed Grace volunteered because she loved serving. So did I. But she wasn't filling empty afternoons. No. She was filling a promise nobody else kept. Just then, footsteps echoed across the basement floor. Thomas Avery stood at the doorway. The church treasurer looked surprised to see us. I wondered where everyone had gone. His smile was polite, practiced. His eyes, however, settled immediately on the open portfolio in my hands. "What have you found?" he asked. I closed the folder before answering. "Mostly history." He nodded slowly. "Some history is better left where it belongs." The sentence landed harder than he intended, not because it sounded threatening, because it sounded rehearsed. I smiled gently. "You're probably right." For the first time since Grace died, I lied. I slipped the portfolio back into its box as though nothing inside mattered. Thomas relaxed almost immediately. He believed I had accepted his advice. He didn't know I'd already photographed every page with my phone before he walked into the room. As he helped us lock the archive room, another realization quietly settled into place. Grace hadn't been hiding charity. She had been preserving evidence. And in 4 days, the entire congregation would gather for her memorial service. For the first time since Grace died, I carried a secret she would have approved of. I never mentioned the photographs on my phone. When Thomas Avery called that evening to ask whether Helen and I had found anything useful in the archives, I answered exactly the way he expected. "Nothing that explains much." He sounded relieved. "I'm glad. Sometimes old paperwork only creates new misunderstandings." "I suppose you're right." We ended the conversation politely, but one sentence kept echoing in my head. New misunderstandings. The truth wasn't creating confusion. The truth threatened an old comfort that had survived for more than 2 decades. The following morning, I visited the Ramirez family. Not because I knew what to ask, because after reading their names so many times, they had become real people instead of a file number. Helen had quietly written their address on the back of a church bulletin before leaving the office. A modest white house stood at the end of Maple Street. Fresh paint covered most of the porch, but the railing still showed repairs made years apart by different hands. It reminded me of aircraft that remained airworthy only because generation after generation of mechanics refused to let them fail. Maria Ramirez answered the door. She looked to be in her late 60s. When I introduced myself, her eyes immediately softened. "You were Grace's husband." I nodded. "I wish we'd met sooner." "So do I." She invited me inside without another question. Family photographs covered one wall. Grace appeared in several of them, never in the center. Always standing slightly behind everyone else, exactly where she preferred to be. Maria poured coffee before either of us mentioned the donations. Finally, she spoke. "Grace told us you would come someday." Those words caught me completely off guard. "She said that?" "Years ago." "What exactly did she say?" Maria smiled sadly. "If Dean ever asks questions, it means I'm no longer here. Tell him only what belongs to your family. The rest is for the church to answer." Even now, Grace was still protecting people. I placed one anonymous receipt on the kitchen table. Maria looked at it for only a second. "I never saw these." "You didn't?" "No. We received grocery vouchers, school supplies, sometimes rent assistance. But Grace never wanted us to know where the money came from. That changed everything." The Ramirez family hadn't been keeping Grace's secret. They hadn't even known it existed. Maria disappeared into another room and returned carrying a weathered recipe tin. Inside were birthday cards, Christmas notes, Photographs. One folded letter rested beneath them all. The only thing Grace ever asked us to save. The envelope wasn't addressed to Maria. It simply read, "For whoever finally needs the truth." Inside was a single handwritten page. If you are reading this, someone has begun searching for records instead of remembering people. Please don't let my gifts become anyone's excuse. The reason they were needed existed long before the donations did. No names, no accusations. Only one final instruction. Start with the meeting before you judge the people who survived it. Driving home, I realized I had misunderstood the entire investigation. I thought Grace had spent 22 years correcting a financial mistake. She hadn't. She had spent 22 years protecting human beings from the consequences of a decision made by people who were afraid of embarrassment. When I pulled into my driveway, Helen's truck was already waiting. She stepped out holding an empty archive box. Her face had gone pale. "Dean, what happened? I came in early this morning. And the hidden portfolio is gone." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "But that's impossible." Helen slowly shook her head. "They didn't just take the copies. They cleaned the shelf. Like the portfolio was never there at all." I looked toward the cedar box resting on my dining room table through the front window. For a brief moment, it seemed as though every piece of Grace's carefully preserved history was disappearing one shelf at a time. Then I remembered the photographs stored safely on my phone. The originals might be gone. But the truth no longer belonged to the archive. The morning before Grace's memorial service, I walked into St. Matthew's carrying nothing more suspicious than a toolbox. No one questioned it. For nearly 20 years, if something squeaked, rattled, or refused to close properly, people expected to find me somewhere in the building with a screwdriver in my hand. Familiar routines are powerful disguises. Grace understood that long before I ever did. Thomas Avery greeted me in the fellowship hall with the relaxed smile of a man who believed the worst had already passed. "Morning, Dean." "Morning. Ready for tomorrow?" "As ready as anyone can be." He rested a hand on my shoulder. Grace would have wanted us focused on remembering her, not digging through old paperwork. I've been thinking the same thing. It wasn't entirely a lie. Grace had never wanted attention, but she had spent 22 years making certain the truth would survive after she was gone. Thomas smiled, satisfied. "I appreciate that." As he walked away, I noticed him glance toward the archive hallway before checking his watch. Not fear. Routine. Almost as if he expected someone to arrive. I spent the next hour replacing loose hinges on the fellowship room cabinets. Every few minutes I looked up just enough to notice who entered the office and who left it. Years of aircraft maintenance had taught me that patterns mattered more than isolated events. At 10:17, Thomas disappeared into the records office carrying nothing. At 10:29, he emerged holding a plain manila envelope. He tucked it beneath his jacket before greeting two volunteers with the same calm expression he'd worn all week. I pretended not to notice. That afternoon, Helen joined me in the maintenance room. "You saw him." "I did." "What do we do?" "We wait." She looked surprised. "That's all?" "For now." I unlocked my toolbox and removed a folder containing printed copies of every photograph I'd taken from the hidden portfolio. The originals had vanished. The digital images were backed up. These paper copies were stored somewhere no one connected to the archives would ever think to search. Helen slowly exhaled. So he can't destroy the evidence anymore. No. He can only destroy what he thinks is the evidence. For the first time all week, she smiled. Grace would have liked that. Before leaving, Helen handed me a sealed envelope she had found tucked inside Grace's old choir music cabinet. I almost forgot. It slipped behind a shelf years ago. My name appeared on the front in Grace's handwriting. Not a farewell letter. Just one sentence. When protecting people and protecting the truth seem like opposite choices, wait. Time often reveals they're the same. I folded the note carefully into my wallet. By sunset, the memorial volunteers had nearly finished decorating the sanctuary. The blue choir ribbon rested across Grace's framed photograph. Fresh lilies surrounded the platform. Everything looked peaceful, which made the phone call I received 20 minutes later feel even more out of place. Maria Ramirez sounded frightened. Dean, someone came by. Who? I don't know. He asked whether Grace had ever left us any papers. What did you tell him? The truth, that she never trusted us with documents. Only kindness. After we hung up, I sat quietly inside my truck for several minutes. The investigation had changed again. Whoever was trying to erase Grace's legacy was no longer searching church archives. They were searching people. I looked toward the sanctuary lights glowing against the evening sky. Tomorrow, the church would gather to honor my wife. Thomas Avery believed he had removed every dangerous document. He believed I had accepted his version of history. He believed the memorial would close the past forever. As I slipped Grace's note back into my wallet, one question settled over me with unexpected clarity. If the truth protects innocent people, isn't silence sometimes the greatest lie of all? Tomorrow, Thomas would have one final opportunity to tell that truth himself. I no longer believed he would take it. Grace's memorial service began exactly the way she would have wanted. No grand procession, no elaborate speeches. Just the quiet sound of the choir singing the same hymn she'd hummed every Sunday while washing breakfast dishes. The faded blue ribbon rested across the corner of her framed photograph, and for a moment I almost expected to see her slip into the alto section a few seconds late, smiling apologetically the way she always had. The sanctuary was full. Pastor Williams stood near the pulpit. Samuel Pierce directed the choir with trembling hands. Helen Mercer sat in the second pew, holding a tissue she hadn't stopped twisting all morning. 3 rows behind her, Maria Ramirez sat with her children and grandchildren. Few people recognized them. Grace would have. Thomas Avery stood beside the platform reviewing the printed memorial program. He looked calm, confident. Whatever worry had shadowed him during the previous week had disappeared. He believed every dangerous record was gone. When Pastor Williams finished his opening prayer, he invited anyone who wished to share a memory of Grace. I slowly stood. No one seemed surprised. A husband always speaks. I carried only a small folder, nothing more. I've spent the last week learning something about my wife, I began. For 50 years, I believed I knew exactly why Grace stayed after choir every Sunday. A quiet ripple moved through the room. I was wrong. Thomas lowered his eyes. I thought she volunteered because she couldn't bear to leave work unfinished. A few people smiled. That sounded like Grace. It was. But it wasn't the whole truth. I held up one anonymous donation receipt. No name. No recognition. Just another Sunday. Several choir members leaned forward. For 22 years, my wife made anonymous gifts to one church assistance account. Soft whispers filled the sanctuary. Thomas remained perfectly still. I asked Samuel. He answered honestly. I asked Helen. She answered honestly. I even asked the Ramirez family. Maria slowly bowed her head. They answered honestly, too. I paused. They simply didn't know the entire story. Now every eye turned toward Thomas Avery. He finally stood. Dean, I don't think this is the appropriate place. His voice remained calm, measured. This service should honor Grace. It should, I answered. Which is exactly why we're here. Thomas took one careful step forward. Some old financial matters can easily be misunderstood. I agree. So let's avoid misunderstandings. I opened the folder. Instead of original documents, I removed printed photographs, large enough for everyone near the front to see. The original files disappeared. Several people exchanged confused looks. So did the backup portfolio. Thomas's expression changed almost imperceptibly. But photographs don't disappear. I placed the first enlarged image on the lectern. Meeting minutes. Grace's handwritten note. Need doesn't wait for next quarter. Silence spread across the sanctuary. The second photograph showed the attendance ledger. Week after week. Grace. The Ramirez family. Anonymous gifts. The third image displayed the official recommendation postponing emergency assistance. I looked directly at Thomas. You once told me some history belongs in the past. He slowly lowered his head. I believed protecting the church meant protecting its reputation. No. My voice remained steady. Grace believed protecting the church meant protecting the people it had failed. No one moved. No one spoke. Pastor Williams quietly accepted the photographs from my hand and read each page himself. When he finished, he looked toward Thomas. Is any of this inaccurate? Thomas closed his eyes. For several long seconds, the sanctuary remained perfectly still. Finally, he answered, No. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I recommended delaying assistance. I told myself we'd recover financially. I told myself the Ramirez family would understand. They almost lost everything before help finally came. He looked toward Maria. I've carried that shame every Sunday since. Then he turned toward the congregation. When Grace began giving anonymously, I asked her not to tell anyone. She agreed. But she also said one day the records should speak if our courage never did. He looked back at me. I kept hiding the records. She kept preserving them. Pastor Williams slowly folded the meeting minutes and addressed the congregation. Today's memorial has become something more. It has become an opportunity to tell the truth our sister Grace patiently waited decades to protect. As the choir began singing again, I looked once more at the faded blue ribbon resting beside Grace's photograph. For the first time since she died, I understood why she never wanted applause. She had always trusted the truth to arrive in its own time. The weeks after Grace's memorial felt quieter than the weeks after her funeral. Grief still visited every morning when I reached for the second coffee cup before remembering I no longer needed it. But the silence inside our home had changed. It no longer carried unanswered questions. It carried her voice clearer than it had been in years. The church council met the following Tuesday. No one argued with the evidence. The photographed meeting minutes, the attendance ledger, the donation receipts, and Thomas Avery's public acknowledgement fit together too cleanly to dismiss. Nothing depended on a dramatic confession alone. The records Grace had quietly preserved over 22 years told the same story from different directions. Thomas offered his resignation as treasurer. Pastor Williams accepted it, but not before thanking him for finally choosing honesty over reputation. There would be new financial oversight, a complete review of the assistance ministry, and a permanent archive policy requiring duplicate preservation of every important record. The church could not change what had happened 22 years earlier, but it could refuse to repeat it. A week later, the congregation gathered once more. This time there were no flowers surrounding a memorial photograph. Instead, Maria Ramirez and her family stood near the front of the sanctuary as Pastor Williams quietly acknowledged something that had never before been spoken aloud. Grace Collins taught us that protecting another person's dignity is also an act of worship. No applause followed. Grace would have hated applause. People simply stood together in respectful silence. After the service, Maria handed me the weathered recipe tin she had shown me in her kitchen. It belongs with you now. Inside, beneath the Christmas cards and faded photographs, rested the blue choir ribbon Grace had left folded so carefully years before. I tied it around the cedar box sitting on my bookshelf, exactly where she had once tied it herself. For the third time, the ribbon meant something different. It had begun as an ordinary choir keepsake, then became the key to a hidden mystery. Now it simply reminded me that quiet faithfulness often leaves the strongest evidence behind. Before leaving the church, Samuel placed Grace's favorite hymnal into my hands. Inside the cover, she had written only one sentence. Kindness becomes legacy when someone else chooses to continue it. The following Sunday, the anonymous assistance envelope returned to the offering office. No signature, just a modest gift. No one asked who had left it there. Some traditions don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone willing to carry them forward. If Grace's story reminded you that quiet acts of compassion often matter more than public recognition, I hope you'll carry that thought into someone's life this week. Sometimes the greatest legacy we leave isn't what people know about us. It's what they quietly choose to do because of us. May your home be filled with peace. Your memories become a source of strength rather than sorrow. And may you never underestimate the lasting power of one faithful act of kindness.